So the question specifically to interacting with the guides, mentors, also perceiving their messages, because I assume most of it is not in your classical back and forth dialogue. How can one best position themselves to interact or perceive these messages?
I started a daily practice of recording my dreams in 1981, and I have a nearly complete record of every day of dreams since then. Many, many contacts over the years. Keep radiating and I'll keep pouring the energy in. And gradually, consciousness expands according to the field that you're working in when you're doing that radiating. Other questions? Here's one.
I don't know if it's appropriate. I would like to know, because you were talking about, it was not the word you used, but I understood like some interaction between the devas from nature and our planet. What kind of interaction? Could you give an example of what kind of interaction can occur from meeting those sort of planes? Sorry, my English is very bad.
To the microphone.
It's over.
Oh, okay.
The batteries.
I need new batteries.
Batteries. Maybe it's a sign. Could you give examples maybe of what kind of, sorry, it's going down, of what kind of interactions can occur from meeting these planes?
So one of the best places to go for that kind of information is a book that was published in the 1970s, and you might still be able to find it, and it may be in more than one language, about a spiritual community in the north of Scotland called Findhorn. And while it was not specifically a theosophical community, there were many people in it who were aware of theosophical teachings and were especially interested in the idea of working with devas and nature spirits. So their project was to create a sustainable community of its own. And they bought some land for that purpose. And the land was not particularly usable for growing food. So they had the idea, because they were involved with a woman named Dorothy McLean, who was able to talk with angels and devas. They had the idea of, well, why don't we ask that how we can create a sustainable community here and grow our own food. And there were communications that are quoted in the book from devas of the soil, devas of the landscape, devas of the different plants they wanted to use. And the communications were often very specific about what needed to be added to the soil and when things needed to be planted. And the result of all of this was, according to the story, that without any kind of chemical fertilizer, they ended up with enormous produce, cabbages this big, and so on. So this was really a demonstration to the world of what can happen when there's a collaboration between devas and nature spirits. And the whole process of building the community and many of the communications that were received by Dorothy McLean and sometimes others are included in the book. I understand that the community still exists, and it's a kind of retreat center that people can go to. I don't know to what extent it still maintains its connection to the values that it was founded with, but I imagine there's probably still a very strong sense of being a presence there just because of how the community was developed at the beginning. In terms of my work here, I can just explain something that I learned this morning. So, in the meditation garden, there's that statue of St. Francis, and when I saw it the first time on this visit, something wasn't quite right, and I could feel that somehow the deva that was in the statue was having trouble connecting through the new stone pedestal down into the earth. So I puzzled about that because I didn't know what or why, and I thought, well, maybe I could help it find that connection, but it didn't work. And Parsifal, the liberal Catholic bishop that we met yesterday, he's also clairvoyant, and he's very, and his priest, Jose, priest of this liberal Catholic church, they're both very interested in maintaining the integrity and health and well-being of the deva landscape. So I mentioned this to him, and he said, oh, last time I was there, it wasn't a problem. So I went back this morning to see what was happening and learned that something needed to happen that was different from what Parsifal had been doing. The three statues there are all about compassion for suffering, human suffering and suffering of animals. And what I learned from the deva was that something that I call a grounding cord needed to be extended from the statue through the base, through the levels of the earth, and connected all the way down to the center of the earth. And that the purpose of the grounding cord was to take the sorrows and the suffering that people might bring with them to the statues and take it away and put it away in a place where it would be broken down and recycled and turned into new life force and vitality for the world. And that all three of the devas in the garden wanted to be able to do the same thing. So I went around to each one and I created the grounding cord. And then I was told that some object needs to be placed in the middle of their triangle and another grounding cord created that then ties the other three together so that the whole garden becomes a place of compassion for human suffering and sort of absorbing it from people. And that it might help because people do take prayers to the different beings. They leave objects and things near the Buddha or the Virgin Mary. They wouldn't really need to do that because they could sit in the garden and there would be a sense of peace and a freedom to let go of whatever they were carrying with them. So when I get information like this, I usually write a report and I offer it to the ITC, and the committee talks about it and talks about the best possible way to go forward with it. And then on some subsequent visit, when they've taken action, I'll try to see whether the thing is actually working or not. So in this case, it isn't about growing vegetables, it's about creating an energy field that is sustainable for the devas and welcoming and supportive of human growth. So I hope that answered your question. Is there another? Let's go on to our advanced practice. This is primarily advanced because it requires a certain amount of dedication. I was going to talk yesterday on the dedicated life, and essentially what I meant by the dedicated life is a life dedicated to service of all beings, a life dedicated to journey back to the source, a life dedicated to developing something like the mind of the masters at each level of being on the ladder of oneness that I was describing. So this is for people who want to go deeper and explore that idea of being of service and dedicating life to service of all beings. So the instructions are, this is again primarily a mode of self-reflection, which can be done either in meditation or in writing in a journal, possibly in conversation with another person if you're practicing side by side, maybe in a class, although you have to do some careful thinking about how to present it in a group. So take one of the 7 questions I'll be presenting in a moment for a day or a week as a subject for meditation. Sit with the question in silence for 5 minutes or more. 5 minutes is really enough. And note any physical, emotional, mental, or spiritual responses to this question. If desired, you can write these responses in a journal or share insights with a partner. So the questions have to do with these subjects, some of which I've mentioned in the course of my lectures. Gratitude, as I mentioned, gratitude to the devas. Flow, as in the idea of turning stuckness into flow. I haven't talked so much about forces, but my feeling and understanding and personal way of looking at things is that every human event is a series of forces coming together to create it. And that the forces are, you could call them karmic, they can come from a number of different people, they can come from different levels of being, but it's often the case that there are beings responsible for directing them. And so if you examine the forces in play, you can often get information about why this event is being developed. So, for example, investigating the forces in play around the re-election of Donald Trump in America, one of the forces that became apparent to me was that the younger generations, the people in their teens, 20s, maybe early 30s, have grown up in an environment that was very supportive of their growth and have a lot of expectations around that, and also a lot of resentment towards the generations that preceded them because of ways in which laws and rules and controls were established that were meant, in a sense, to limit their power before they came on the scene, and that these young people need something really strong to help them wake up to the reality that they can create their own future, and that by motivating themselves to work against some of the things that come up, some of the forces that come up, while Donald Trump is in power, can actually have that effect. So that's just a simple example of looking at forces in play and learning something from them. Fears, consequences. The fears are about things we haven't done yet that we're contemplating doing. Consequences are about the past and our relationship to it. The conditions are about the actual experience of our growth right now. What are the conditions of our growth? And agency means how much power do we actually have to change things? How much do we give ourselves, or how much does the circumstance that we're in allow? Your responses to these questions will gradually build within you what I call a temple of serenity that supports the development of buddhi, unity consciousness. Anxiety is probably the greatest enemy of serenity. Anxiety is a worldwide problem. It's become clearer and clearer to the younger generations that help is needed of various kinds to deal with anxiety, because it becomes ever more crippling, in a sense, or paralyzing. So the Temple of Serenity basically requires that you learn how to deal with and even let go of anxiety in order to support the development of unity consciousness. Because anxiety on behalf of all of the forces that are creating separateness in the world essentially means that you're operating under their power. And if you free yourself from that, from the perception and the conception of that, you're opening and allowing buddhi to develop, unity consciousness. And it becomes easier to spread in the world just by your very existence. In the way that Leadbeater was talking about with the group that went to Washington about the crime, meditating, hundreds of people meditating and the crime level being affected. Well, it wasn't Leadbeater, sorry.
Yeah, yes, I talked to me yesterday, yes.
Yeah. Lupe.
Yes.
Maharishi, yes.
Yeah.
But I imagine in the spiritual tradition that you were coming from, similar beliefs were present?
No, not at all.
No,
I was...
not you, I'm talking to Leadbeater.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Ja, voor mij is they go out every week, every day to the streets.
Yeah, okay, so it's a similar idea. That's why I was thinking about you. Okay. When combined with the 4 steps practice and the ladder of lives practice, these questions will help you approach the mind of the master. Not the mind of a master that would be someone that you would study with, but the way of thinking that allows a master to be everything that Annie Besant talks about. The more we approach that, the more we get the support that we need. And from my perspective, the initiations don't matter. It's just steps in the development of recognizing the needs of the world, expanding our consciousness to embrace them, finding a way to satisfy those needs to the extent that we're able to, and then being open and allowing support from invisible, non-physical beings for that purpose, and developing spiritual abilities or so-called psychic abilities to help you serve more deeply. If you want to go deeper with this exploration, you can also use the 2 open-ended questions. What do I need to know right now about this aspect of life? What do I need to do right now based on this knowledge? So now come the questions. Each question leads to the next, but as I mentioned, only one per day or only one per week is the ideal mode of practice. And as I mentioned earlier, these questions, the two open-ended questions, can invite the support of inner guidance. The answers can help you discover right best next steps to take and joy. Again, this is my practice. I know it works, at least for me, so I'm offering it to you. You can see if it's helpful for you. The first question about gratitude is, am I willing to be grateful for the existence and guidance of higher powers? This opens the channel, so to speak, for those higher powers to manifest themselves. Now, of course, you might say, well, of course I'm willing. I believe in them. Isn't that enough? But it's phrased in this way so that you ask yourself, where might I not be showing up or being fully present for higher powers? Where may I not be kind? Where may I not know how to take a step in joy? It might sound silly to talk about asking yourself the question, where may I not be kind with respect to higher powers? But how many of us get angry at God for the things that we're having to deal with that we don't think we should have to deal with? And even if it's just a 1 second long thought, that's not kind to ourselves or to higher powers. So, am I willing is also an attempt in that phrasing to work against the tendency of the mind level of being to always want to do things forcefully and with will. So the real way of working is not forcefully and with will, but allowing and opening and unfolding. So I think you'll find some very interesting results come first from asking yourself the question about a willingness to be grateful, and then examining perhaps where you're being grateful, where you're showing it. If you talk about your good luck, you might be forgetting there's a being behind the good luck that you could be thanking. So, this question opens interconnections to all helpful and supportive beings. You can call them what you wish, or they can come from any level of reality. If it's higher than you, masters, teachers, devas. As one of my friends puts it, when I pray to whoever's on duty. It doesn't matter. I don't know their name, it doesn't matter. Whoever's on duty, that's where my prayer is going. It also opens outer perception of all the ways in which help is available, all the things to be grateful for, coincidences, synchronicities, omens, messages from books or chance remarks of people. And it allows for an experience of the inner and the outer worlds in terms of oneness or unity consciousness. Because gratitude is an opening to recognize the beingness, the existence of these non-visible forces, and an understanding that whether you know it consciously or not, they're supporting you and you're learning and growth in a variety of ways. Just being thankful for their presence is a gateway to learning more about how they work. And then it opens the way to understanding karma as what I call a grace machine, or the great grace machine. My definition of grace is aligned with Source. If you're in that quiet spiritual joy I was talking about earlier, that's grace. Churches may have a different definition of that, but I think ultimately it boils down to the same thing. It's never about whether we deserve grace or don't deserve grace. It's more about, in a sense, being an agent of this grace machine. Now, grace machine is my replacement for the notion of karma. I do this because people tend to think in terms of karma in a polarized way. So there's good karma or bad karma. And you're supposed to avoid creating the bad karma or work it off in some way and somehow discover how to create good karma. The way that this can be abused can be seen in some forms of Mahayana Buddhism, where you're told to do all these beneficial actions and then offer them up to the monastery or to other people to make use of. And, you know, in a way it sounds wonderfully selfless, but at the same time, there's so much intentionality. Oh, I'm going to do good deeds because of this or that or the other thing. If we're all on a journey back to Source, that's all there is. And my understanding is that the only sin or the only negative karma is the result of actions that cause us to turn our backs on Source. And if we turn our backs on people or animals, we're turning our backs on Source. So when we figure out what to do to turn ourselves back towards Source, we have that experience of joy that I'm calling grace. But it's also a machine. It's a relentless machine. In other words, God consciousness, or Source is trying to say, hey, I'm joy. Hey, you want joy? Okay, allow it. Take as much as you want. And the humans are saying, no, it's too bright. No, it's too much. A famous German expression that I learned from one of my friends, es ist zu viel. It's too much. Well, okay, that says something about our level of development. In other words, in a sense, our advancement, our spiritual advancement is a measure not so much of initiations and even so much of service, but our capacity for getting closer to Source and not being obliterated by the amount of joy that we're experiencing. If we're developing our true sense of service, you could say that's the thing that we were created for from the beginning of time, the place that we hold in the universe and within God consciousness. That creates a solid core that can never be destroyed and that allows us to get closer to Source. So everything we do to follow our Dharma, our true self, is developing that core and making it possible to take a step closer to Source. And the way always is through service and the knowledge that we're on the right path, that we're taking right best next steps, is always that quiet spiritual joy or something more. People who deeply suffer may have turned themselves very deeply away from Source, and they may have very strong beliefs about why that was needed because of some serious trauma in their life, some kind of abuse that occurred, or some kind of crime that was committed that affected them, such as the murder of a relative, things like that. How could they live in a universe where such a thing could happen? How could people have souls that should prevent it? How could there be angels that should have prevented it? How could God have allowed it? These are the kinds of questions that cause a turning away from Source. And Source is going to beat them over the head with every conceivable miracle to get them to turn back, until eventually they let the energy of Source come back in. So that's what I mean by karma, or our learning and growth as a grace machine. We can't stop it. It is always working for good. It doesn't always work for good in ways that we expect or understand. In the long view of things, eventually maybe we will see those things are. So, understanding of karma as a grace machine is essentially a precursor to the possibility of creating what I call a dedicated life, dedicating oneself to being an agent of the grace machine. Now, if I said dedicating yourself to be an agent of karma, doesn't that sound scary? Maybe the grace machine is a little less so. So the second question is, let's say you've meditated on gratitude for a week. So with your willingness to feel gratitude for the existence and guidance of higher powers established by meditating for a week, then you're ready to ask the question, am I willing to be an agent of turning stuckness into flow? This is the simplest expression of the grace machine. If two people are really blocked in their movement forward together in a friendship or a relationship, and you're able to sit down with them and be a witness to their talking back and forth so that both of them feel safe to express things they might not feel safe to express if they were alone, that would be an example of turning stuckness into flow. It's often very simple. It's often the easiest, right, best next step to take. There's usually a sense of relief when it's been taken. Sometimes it's clearly for the greater good, a larger network of family and friends or a community to take this kind of time. It's also often an easy thing to do if you consider a couple of things. I think almost everybody suffers from the feeling of not ever really having been fully and warmly welcomed in this world, whether it was fully and warmly welcomed into a family of young parents who were frightened and anxious about having a child, or whether it was the first school that you went to, or any school after that, or any job that you've gone into. There's constantly this problem of not really being welcomed. So one of the best ways to turn stuckness into flow is being a welcoming force for other people. And it's a simple practice. I didn't mention it in the slides, but it's a simple practice. It's another form of showing up, being fully present, being kind to yourself and others, and taking a step in joy. It's giving them the thing that you almost never get. And that has several parts. First, deep listening. Just listening. Letting them know that they're heard. The second thing is letting them know that they're understood. And the third thing is letting them know that they're loved. And if you want to add something to this, letting them know that they're welcome. You're grateful for their presence in their life. This can do a lot to turn stuckness into flow. So showing up to listen, being fully present in the sense of listening deeply, being kind to yourself and others by showing that you understand, and then taking a step in joy in letting the individual know that they're loved and welcome in the world and welcome in your life. So stuckness, as I define it, is a tangle of ego-based motives, agendas, likes and dislikes, and represents a breakdown of unity consciousness. Discovering the right best next step for the greater good as guided by higher powers is essentially, first, turning stuckness into flow. And then taking one step at a time instead of trying to solve the whole problem. This we do all the time. We might be an older soul in a situation. The problem is younger souls not really understanding it. We see a solution that embraces the whole thing. We try to present it. They don't understand it. They start pushing back against it. And the problem is we're not thinking of them as people. We're thinking of them as part of the problem. And we're trying to impose our idea of a solution on them. And that solution comes from past lives where we've already learned how to deal with that. And they need to learn the lesson for the first time. So the important thing is turning stuckness into flow isn't solving the problem, but it's pointing people just a little bit more in the direction of source so they might be able to solve the problem for themselves. And then flow is a mutual feeling of relief, joy, and movement that represents a restoration of unity consciousness, often with gratitude on both sides. With forces, once a sense of flow has been established in a situation, am I willing to investigate the forces in play? This helps you trace these forces back to their causes in self and other. Now, various types of clairvoyance are talked about in theosophical teachings. Supposedly, each body has its own kind of clairvoyance. So if you were to look into the Arthur Powell books on the bodies the astral body, in particular the mental body, and the book The Causal Body and the Ego, you'll learn about astral vision. There's also etheric vision, astral vision, mental vision, and causal vision. Causal vision has the ability to perceive the causes of things, and that's the whole reason why causal is attached to that level of being. That's the level of being that we incarnated from. All of the causes of our life are present there. You could say it's a map of our learning and growth held by the soul. So you're actually training yourself to use causal vision when you start looking at things in terms of forces in play. And it's always helpful to do that. You know, I'll just throw out an example. There was a movie that came out a few years ago called Knives Out, and it was about an inheritance and a group of people, and it was a mystery who was killing people. You know, it's a fascinating film because it's so clear about the forces in play. And anybody who's gone through a will and inheritance dispute in the family will recognize how vivid and true these forces are and how active. They usually operate behind the scenes, but they're clearly displayed in the film, and you constantly see how your understanding of the larger dynamic changes as you become aware of a different force in play that is represented by one of the characters. So, in a sense, that movie came as an expression, or developed as an expression of causal vision, even though most people would think of it as a mystery film. I think it has this higher teaching power. So, the power of tracing causes really can help you understand better how to serve the greater good of all. If you're trying to come up with a solution without considering the other people involved, you're trying to solve the problem of how annoyed you are that they have a problem. And that's never useful. Because that becomes a force in play, and then they'll doubt you. So this question also can help to reveal the true needs of yourself and others that are behind each of these forces. So, you know, it's typical of novels. You'll see that, like Sherlock Holmes, for example, you'll see the character that is the criminal, and then you'll find out that the character was motivated by desperation for an ill child that they couldn't help in any other way. And then what do you do with that? Reading Sherlock Holmes is actually another way of training causal vision. So people who feel guilty about reading mystery novels no longer need to feel that. It's a spiritual practice. Unless you like blood, then it's something else. Personally, I like the ones where there's not much blood on stage, like Sherlock Holmes. It can also encourage the finding of the right best next step that allow the needs that are revealed by the causes to be satisfied. So with fears, once you've gone into this inquiry, you may have traced the problem back to its origin in some fear or anxiety. So the question here is, am I willing to turn my fears into intentions to grow? Well, I say this pretty often to my students and in my classes, and they come to the classes and I'm so anxious, I have this step that I need to take. And, you know, it's all of these things hang on it. The amount of time I'm working, the amount of money I'm making, the kind of people I'm working with. Oh dear, how can I possibly make this important decision? Well, the advice is stop investing it with fear and turning it into an intention to grow. How is this a growth opportunity? How could you show up for this growth opportunity? How could you be fully present for this growth opportunity? How could you enter it with the intention of being kind to yourself and others? Is the workplace going to be kind towards you? Then it may be possible to make the decision in joy instead of anxiety, fear, and ambivalence. So, as I mentioned earlier, I think trauma is a turning away from source, and that would include spiritual, mental, emotional, and physical trauma. And the essential question is, why did this happen to me? And until people start to get some insight into that, they may not be able to move forward. The grace machine will keep trying, but they may be too closed to let it in. But, as I mentioned, karma is the grace machine, is the force that turns us back towards source. Fear of disappointment, pain, suffering, failure, and inadequacy is all really fear of karma. But the willingness to grow is a realignment with the grace machine. So really, in all areas of life where we're not unhappy or where we're anxious, all we need to say is, universe, I don't know how to do this. Please teach me how. And, as I mentioned earlier, whoever's on duty might show up in some way to support you. But the anxiety creates such a wall of confusion. It's almost like a spinning vortex that will just throw everything useful away before it even comes to you. So this question is intended to break that down. With regard to consequences, once intentions have been established, intentions to grow, am I willing to be responsible for the consequences of my actions? In a sense, that's not only willingness to learn no matter where the learning takes you, but it's also willingness to learn from the negative, apparently negative consequences of past actions. Am I willing to learn from the past? Too often, we're so ashamed or so embarrassed about the possibility of repeating the past that we end up repeating it anyway because we don't really have any other choice. If we let go of all of that, that opens the way for true, authentic, new learning and growth. We could see the frustrations and disappointments of the past as the result of having pursued wrong or inappropriate goals or steps, or trying to skip steps because we were too impatient about wanting to get to the goal. And also, when people say to themselves, I should have known better, this is deadly. It cancels any possibility of learning something from the past. Because the fact is, if you had known better, you wouldn't have done it. And if you're telling yourself you should have known better, you'll do it again because you haven't actually learned the real lesson behind it. We have to learn to own what we learned, even if it was disappointing, because that's what allows for new growth and lessons. The sixth of the 7 questions has to do with conditions. With responsibility established in the previous question, am I willing to accept the conditions of my growth as the beginning point for change? How do you know when someone's not accepting the conditions of their growth? They complain. So, how motivated is someone who is complaining to change their situation? Probably not at all. Probably the whole purpose of the complaining is to get someone else to do the dirty work. But the real issue is you have to be responsible for the consequences of your actions, and that means that the conditions of your growth are all in some way there because of some learning and growth that needs to take place, and is all there because of the karma of not having known how to do it right in the past. So that's why it's so important to learn how to accept the conditions of growth. If you don't do that, there's no beginning point for creating change. We have to understand that current conditions are perfect given what we have to learn. That is, in effect, our karma or our dharma. And we have to see that likes and dislikes are essentially resistance to karma and the basis of human suffering. Because when we like something, we try to repeat it, we try to go back after it, we can become obsessed with that, and we often like things that aren't good for us. On the other hand, we often try to do everything we can to keep away things that we dislike. But when we do that, we're putting out so much energy and so much will towards keeping it out that the universe says, oh, that person has a problem with that thing, and it just pushes it harder in from the other side. We often dislike the things that we don't want to do and need to do. So essentially, this question of am I willing to accept the conditions of my growth as the beginning point for change is an attempt to get rid of the likes and dislikes and really just show up and be fully present in this moment. And then you can start looking at the steps you want to take. And then accepting the conditions of your growth also can allow for acceptance of the grace machine as growth and joy. So clearly the cancer diagnosis had its own karmic causes for me, but I decided to do it in joy and was very much supported by the grace machine as a medical team, wonderful nurses, and the fact that the treatments, which cost tens of thousands of dollars a piece over the course of a number of months and years, somehow I didn't have to pay for it. It was taken care of. So now I have to say that my landlord and his wife were very devout Catholics, and when they heard I had this diagnosis, they put me on their rosary, on their prayer beads, and they take all the credit. But I think it was my attitude of joy. Gratitude to higher powers as agents of the grace machine. So at this point, once we've accepted the conditions of our growth, we can also accept all the help that's there for us from all of the beings who are the forces in play that created those conditions. So you can see how all of these questions are woven together. And then finally, the question about agency. Agency means our feeling of empowerment to do any particular thing, and then the action that follows from that. With gratitude, with flow, with inquiry, with intentions, with responsibility, and with acceptance of the conditions of our growth, all established, may I become an agent of the great grace machine. This is how we learn to will, think, speak, feel, act with the mind of the masters. And there is our ceremony of the masters gathering for the appearance of the Buddha at Vaishak, first full moon in May every year, as envisioned by an artist based on the description by C.W. Leadbeater. That concludes my presentation. So this is the Dutch version. The American version and English version is not so beautiful. So this will be one of the PDFs that I'll send you. I'll send you PDFs of all the slides that can become a study guide if you wish. Are there any questions about this before we go off to our last lunch together? Floyd.
It's just a suggestion. During the slides, there was a slide about how we can provide the elementals with quality nourishment, and you give examples. I think it will be very, very useful to listen to the slides as well. So.
Oh yeah, okay, thank you, I can do that. That was part of the intermediate practice. There are meditative practices that I've developed for what I call aligning the elementals. I like to teach them in a group before people, I suggest that people do them on their own. But the practice of always trying to do what keeps the elemental happy, that's fairly simple. That's just creating a lifestyle that is essentially growth-oriented and supportive of all levels of who you are. So thank you for that. I can do that.
I was wondering if this lines up with the chakras in any way, because it's 7 forms and seemed to feel like there was something there.
I'm not going to go there.
Okay.
Theosophists love their charts and complexities. And to add another level of complexity to the actual work that's embodied in these slides would not be helpful, because then everyone would be asking themselves which chakra they're working on and not which actions they need to take in the world. So, yeah, I can't go there. Let me say this though. One of the funniest moments of my research into the history of the Theosophical Society was when I discovered that the newspapers in England in the 1890s called them the Sevensers, because they were always turning everything into seven. The Sevensers. So, another question?
I have a question with regard to one of the points, flow. Sometimes one realizes that one has some deep-rooted habits or thought patterns that just come back again and again, as if one is stuck in this kind of pattern. Do you have any advice? And the person realizes it's not very helpful. It's, for example, a jealous person realizes jealousy is not good, but as if he cannot help it, these thoughts just come again and again. And the person feels it's stuck, that he's stuck.
For the example that you've mentioned, the practice that is recommended by Besant is once you've identified the vice, which in this case would be jealousy, you consider the opposite virtue, which would be a loving, unconditional freedom for all people. So that you're not jealous because somebody is doing something that you don't approve of or that you wish you could do yourself, but holding the idea of universal unconditional love or universal unconditional freedom or some combination of both of those. And the idea is that if you withdraw your focus on the jealousy and then instead bring your focus to this other way of being, that it gradually starts to infiltrate the mind as a possibility, and then as a value, which starts to motivate the mind to move into action, and then eventually as an ideal that will become a purpose in life, not just a single action, but a whole way of living. So this movement from thought to value to ideal to action is the way to overcome those bad behaviors. This is to some extent written about in a book, Thought Power by Besant, and another one called The Laws of the Higher Life. Both of them were written about the same time, very early in the 20th century, very good for creating the kind of behavioral change that you're talking about. There's another practice that I do with my students and that I mentioned in my book that I call the big but practice. And what you do is a journal practice, it's a writing practice. You write something, some condition of your life, as if it were in its ideal expression in your life, even though it isn't. You write that at the top of the sheet of paper. So for example, I am absolutely satisfied, fulfilled, and completely happy with every element of my job. So you write that at the top. And then what happens is the mind starts saying, but. So you write down each of these buts, and at the end you have a complete map of all of the fears, intentions, anxieties, everything that we talked about in the other questions to work on in order to allow that experience of being fully satisfied and happy to manifest itself. Not because you've given up on wanting anything, but because you've let go of all the complaining that prevents you from being fully present in this moment as the beginning point of change. So I recommend that exercise. All you do is just listen. And the funny thing about the ego mind is that it holds all of these buts to make sure that you don't take another step closer to source, ever, under any circumstances, because it's scared of being dissolved. Your core self will never be dissolved, but this ego wants to be in control. And so, even though it would never want you to know all of those buts, the minute you assert that your life could be different in the way that I've recommended here, it will try to talk you out of it by giving you all the buts, but it's also giving you the secret plan that it's always used to prevent you from experiencing that happiness. So, any other questions? So it's 12:30, that's time for lunch. Just let's take a moment to sit in silence.